My father told me I dressed like a woman of ill repute and demanded I cover myself up completely, so I decided to give him exactly what he was asking for, though I doubt he expected the turn this would take. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary summer day in Phoenix, Arizona, where the temperature had already climbed to 93 degrees by 10 in the morning. I was 17 years old, heading out to the grocery store to pick up some things for my mother who was working late at the hospital again, and I threw on what any reasonable person would wear in that heat. A simple cotton tank top and a pair of knee-length denim shorts that I'd bought with my own money from my part-time job at the bookstore downtown. As I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter, my father Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face already turning that familiar shade of red that meant trouble was coming. "You are absolutely not leaving this house dressed like that," he said, his voice carrying that tone of authority he'd perfected over his 20 years as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company. I looked down at my completely normal summer outfit, the same kind of clothes every other teenager in Arizona wore when the heat became unbearable, and felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. "Cover yourself up immediately because I will not have my daughter walking around looking like she's advertising herself for sale," he continued, his anger building with each word as if my bare arms and legs below the knee were some kind of personal attack on his reputation. I went back upstairs to my room, feeling the weight of his disapproval following me with each step, and changed into a pair of heavy jeans that immediately made me start sweating and a thick hoodie that felt like wearing a portable sauna in the Arizona heat. When I came back downstairs, he nodded with that satisfied expression he always wore when he got his way, telling me this was about respect and dignity and protecting my reputation in the community, as if anyone at the grocery store would care what a 17-year-old wore to buy milk and eggs. That night, after returning from the store feeling like I'd run a marathon in winter clothes, I sat at my laptop and did some online shopping with the credit card he'd given me for emergencies, deciding that if he wanted me covered up so badly, I would show him exactly what that looked like. "Thank you so much for helping me understand the importance of modesty," I said the next morning, emerging from my room wearing a full-length denim dress that covered everything except my hands and face, the fabric so thick and heavy that walking felt like wading through water. My father seemed pleased at first, smiling as he sipped his morning coffee, until we arrived at his company's quarterly barbecue at Paradise Valley Country Club, where all his colleagues and their families had gathered for an afternoon of networking disguised as casual socializing. Everyone kept approaching us with concerned expressions, asking if I was feeling all right and why on earth I was dressed for a blizzard in the middle of an Arizona summer, their worry becoming more pronounced as they watched sweat dripping down my face despite my attempts to appear comfortable. "She's exploring modest fashion choices," my father explained with forced casualness while his coworkers exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they were thinking something was very wrong in our household. His boss, William Chen, pulled him aside near the buffet table, and I could see them having an intense whispered conversation while William kept glancing over at me standing there in my 3 layers of fabric, looking like I was about to pass out from heat exhaustion. The other teenagers at the party, kids I'd known since middle school when our parents all worked at the same company, kept asking me what was really going on, and I just smiled and said my father had been very clear about the importance of covering up to protect my virtue and reputation. By the time we left the barbecue 3 hours later, I'd overheard at least 4 different conversations about whether my father was forcing me into some kind of religious extremism, and his assistant Jennifer had slipped me her personal phone number, whispering that I should call if I ever needed help. Monday morning arrived with a new level of determination on my part, and I descended the stairs wearing a complete beekeeping suit I'd ordered with overnight shipping from an agricultural supply company. The white protective gear covering every inch of my body, including a mesh face shield that made eating breakfast nearly impossible. My father stared at me across the kitchen table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as I explained cheerfully that he'd been absolutely right about covering up and protecting myself from unwanted attention, and what could possibly protect me better than equipment designed to shield people from angry swarms of bees. The drive to Roosevelt High School was silent, except for the rustling of my protective suit against the car seats. And when we pulled up to the drop-off area, every student within visual range stopped what they were doing to stare at the girl emerging from her father's BMW dressed like she was about to harvest honey. Within an hour of arriving at school, I was sitting in Principal Davidson's office while he called my father, asking in his careful administrative voice whether everything was all right at home, and if there was some medical or psychological reason I was wearing what appeared to be professional apiary equipment to attend classes. My father arrived at the school 20 minutes later, his face cycling through various shades of red and purple as he tried to explain to Principal Davidson, Vice Principal Martinez, and the school counselor Ms. Sarah Chen that this was just teenage rebellion, and I was trying to make some kind of point about fashion choices. I sat there in my beekeeping suit, the mesh hood making my voice slightly muffled as I explained loudly and clearly that my father had called me a word I won't repeat for wearing normal summer clothes, and said my body was shameful and needed to be completely hidden from the eyes of men who might get the wrong idea about what kind of girl I was. Ms. Chen started taking detailed notes in her leather-bound notebook, her expression growing more concerned with each word I spoke, while Principal Davidson asked my father if perhaps family counseling might be beneficial for addressing what seemed to be some concerning dynamics at home. The meeting ended with my father practically dragging me out of the office while trying to maintain his composure in front of the school administrators. But I could see his hands shaking with rage as he signed me out at the front desk, telling the secretary we had a family emergency to attend to. Tuesday brought a new opportunity for my campaign of malicious compliance when my father announced we would be attending an important client dinner at Scottsdale's most exclusive steakhouse, where he was hoping to close a $5 million deal with a group of investors from Tokyo. I arrived at the restaurant wearing a full burka I'd ordered with express shipping from an online retailer that specialized in religious garments, the black fabric covering me so completely that I had to be careful not to trip on the hem as I walked. "This is our daughter, Rachel," my father said weakly as his Japanese clients stared in complete bewilderment at the figure draped entirely in black fabric sitting at their table. The lead investor, Mr. Yamamoto, kept politely trying to understand our family's religious beliefs, asking careful questions about whether this was common practice in American households, while his colleagues exchanged confused glances over their Wagyu steaks. I remained completely silent throughout the meal, eating carefully through my face covering, lifting the fabric slightly with each bite, while the entire restaurant seemed to be watching our table with barely concealed curiosity. My father desperately tried to steer the conversation toward business matters, but Mr. Yamamoto seemed genuinely troubled, pulling him aside after dinner to express concerns about doing business with someone who appeared to have such extreme views about women, and whether this might reflect on their company's values. Wednesday escalated things even further when I appeared at his company picnic wearing a full hazmat suit in bright yellow, complete with chemical protection gear and breathing apparatus. Because if he'd mentioned protection so many times, then surely biological protection was the logical next step. His boss William's wife, Margaret, cornered him by the dessert table with an expression of deep concern, offering him pamphlets about controlling behavior and religious extremism while explaining that the company had employee assistance programs that could help with whatever was obviously going wrong in his household. "If you need resources or someone to talk to about what's happening at home, we're here to support our employees through difficult situations," she said, loud enough for several other executives to hear while glancing worriedly at me, standing in my bright yellow containment suit. I made sure to explain to anyone who asked that my father had made it very clear that my skin was too dangerous to be exposed to public view, and that I was simply following his instructions about maintaining appropriate coverage to protect my reputation and the honor of our family. The picnic, which was supposed to be a celebration of the quarter's sales achievements, turned into a whispered discussion about Marcus Wellington's apparent descent into controlling fanaticism, with several people discreetly taking photos and videos of me in my hazmat suit playing volleyball with the other employees' teenagers. Thursday was parent-teacher conference night at Roosevelt High, and I carefully dressed in a Victorian morning dress I'd found at a vintage shop downtown, complete with a black veil that covered my entire face and gloves that reached my elbows, looking like I'd stepped out of a Gothic novel from the 1800s. My AP history teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, asked my father point-blank if he was abusing me or forcing me into some kind of cult while I sat there looking like a ghostly apparition from another century. "She appears to be crying out for help through these clothing choices," Mr. Rodriguez said sternly while my father tried to explain that I was doing this entirely on my own to spite him. But Mr. Rodriguez had already read my essay about how my father had called me horrible names for wearing weather-appropriate clothing. The other parents in the hallway started whispering and pointing as we moved from classroom to classroom, and I heard more than one person say they were going to call someone about this obvious case of psychological abuse happening right in front of everyone. Mrs. Patterson from the PTA approached us near the chemistry lab, saying she'd noticed my increasingly extreme clothing choices over the past week and wondered if I needed someone safe to talk to about what was happening at home, while my father stood there looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Friday marked the crescendo of my week-long protest when I arrived at my father's promotion announcement dinner, wearing a full suit of medieval armor I'd rented from a theatrical supply company, the metal plates clanking with every step I took into the elegant ballroom of the Phoenician resort. The sound drew everyone's attention immediately as I made my way to our table, where his regional manager, Kevin Brooks, was already seated with his wife and several other senior executives from the pharmaceutical company's Western division. Kevin immediately asked why Marcus's daughter was dressed like she was preparing for battle in the 15th century, his expression suggesting this was the final straw in a week of increasingly bizarre reports about my father's family situation. My father claims my body is a weapon that needs to be contained for the safety of society, I announced to the entire table, my voice echoing slightly inside the metal helmet, and several people immediately took out their phones to record while my father seemed to shrink into his chair. The promotion he'd worked toward for 3 years was put on indefinite hold, pending an investigation into his home situation, with Human Resources scheduling a meeting for Monday morning to discuss the multiple concerns that had been raised by employees who'd witnessed my clothing choices throughout the week. Saturday morning brought an unexpected development when I looked out my bedroom window to see our neighbors gathered on the Johnsons' front lawn, clearly having some kind of meeting that involved frequent gestures toward our house. Mrs. Johnson, who'd lived next door for 15 years and had watched me grow up from a toddler, rang our doorbell an hour later with 5 other concerned neighbors standing behind her on our porch, their faces set with determination. We're extremely concerned about Rachel's well-being and what we've been witnessing this week, Mrs. Johnson said, holding a folder that I could see contained printed photos of me in various costumes, along with what appeared to be a timeline of events. They'd been documenting everything with dates and timestamps, creating what Mrs. Johnson called evidence of escalating abuse that needed to be addressed immediately by the proper authorities. My father kept insisting that I was doing this to spite him and make him look bad, but I maintained perfect innocence, explaining that I was simply following his very clear instructions about modesty and covering my shameful body that was apparently too dangerous for public viewing. The neighbors exchanged worried looks as I stood there in my newest purchase, a vintage deep-sea diving suit complete with a brass helmet that weighed 30 pounds and made walking an exhausting endeavor. By Sunday afternoon, the situation had spiraled completely beyond my father's control when his girlfriend of 6 months, Patricia, sent him a text message ending their relationship, saying she couldn't be with someone who psychologically tortured his daughter to the point where she felt compelled to wear a diving suit in the Arizona heat. His boss, William, had strongly suggested he take family leave to address what was clearly a serious situation at home, and I knew from overhearing his phone calls that Child Protective Services had opened a case file after receiving 17 different reports from concerned citizens who'd witnessed my escalating costume choices throughout the week. My father sat at our kitchen table with his head buried in his hands while I stood there in my brass diving helmet, the weight of it making my neck ache, but the point still needing to be made about following his rules to their logical conclusion. Please just stop this insanity and wear whatever you want, he begged, his voice cracking with exhaustion and defeat. But then his phone rang with my mother's name appearing on the screen, and I knew immediately that things were about to shift dramatically. My mother, Helen, who'd divorced my father 5 years ago and lived across town in Tempe, had been contacted by multiple concerned friends who'd seen photos and videos of me in various costumes throughout the week, and she was now filing for emergency custody based on claims of psychological abuse. As my father answered the phone, his face drained of all color, and he looked at me with something dark and dangerous in his eyes that I'd never seen before, not even during their worst fights before the divorce. Actually, forget about the clothes entirely, he said in a voice so quiet and cold that it sent chills down my spine despite the diving suit's thick rubber material. I have a much better idea for how to teach you a lesson about respect and consequences for your actions. The way he said it, the way his eyes stayed fixed on mine with that cold calculation, made my stomach drop like I was falling from a great height. And I knew instinctively that whatever this better idea was, it meant something far worse than arguments about clothing. The brass diving helmet suddenly felt like it was suffocating me as he stood up from the table and walked toward the stairs without another word, each footstep deliberate and ominous. I grabbed my phone from the table with shaking hands inside the thick rubber gloves, typing as fast as I could to my mother while listening to his footsteps moving around upstairs, drawers opening and closing with purpose. I told her about his threat and the look in his eyes, begging her to come get me immediately because something had shifted in him that felt genuinely dangerous. She texted back within seconds, saying she was already on her way with her lawyer, Sandra Thompson, and that I should stay visible, keep my phone recording, and not be alone with him under any circumstances. I fumbled with the phone settings through the diving gloves and started recording just as his footsteps returned to the top of the stairs, each step down sounding like a countdown to something terrible. He came into the kitchen carrying an old brown suitcase that I recognized from the hall closet, the one he used for business trips before the divorce, and he dropped it on the floor with a heavy thud that made me jump inside my diving suit. "You're going to a wilderness camp for troubled teens starting tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., he announced with a satisfaction in his voice that made me feel sick to my stomach. The place is called Redemption Ranch, and it's located in the middle of nowhere in Utah, and they specialize in breaking the spirits of disrespectful daughters who embarrass their families and destroy their fathers' careers with attention-seeking behavior. He'd already paid the $5,000 deposit while I was upstairs changing into the diving suit earlier, and they'd already dispatched someone to pick me up before dawn. Someone who was experienced in transporting unwilling teenagers to their facility. These camps were notorious for their abuse, and several had been shut down for endangering children, but he didn't care about that. Only about teaching me a lesson about consequences and making me disappear from his life until I learned proper respect. Before I could even process the horror of what he was saying, the doorbell rang with an urgency that made both of us freeze. And through the helmet's small window, I saw my father's confident expression crumble into confusion. My mother stood at the door with Sandra Thompson in her perfect business suit despite it being Sunday evening, and behind them were two officers from the Phoenix Police Department, their presence immediately shifting the entire dynamic of the situation. Mom pushed past my father without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning me in the diving suit with a mixture of relief that I was okay and fury at what she was seeing. While Sandra held up official documents with court seals that caught the light from our entryway chandelier. The emergency custody order has been granted by Judge Catherine Reeves based on immediate safety concerns, Sandra explained in her calm, professional voice while the officers positioned themselves in the doorway, making it clear that any resistance would result in immediate consequences. My father tried to block the doorway, his voice rising as he accused them of kidnapping and conspiracy, saying they had no right to take his daughter from her own home without proper legal proceedings. One of the officers, Officer Rodriguez, stepped forward slightly, his hand resting casually but deliberately near his radio, ready to call for backup if the situation escalated beyond verbal protests. Sandra maintained her composure perfectly, explaining that the emergency custody order was completely legal and valid, effective immediately, and that preventing us from leaving would constitute a violation that could result in his immediate arrest. My father kept pointing at me in the diving suit, saying I was the one causing all this drama and chaos, that I'd manipulated everyone into believing lies about him when all he'd done was try to parent a rebellious teenager who was determined to destroy his life. The officers watched him carefully, noting his agitation and the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching, clearly prepared for the possibility that he might become physically aggressive. My mother told me to go pack my essential belongings immediately, and I waddled up the stairs as fast as the heavy diving suit would allow, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing inside the brass helmet. I grabbed my school backpack and started throwing in random clothes from my dresser, my laptop and charger, my journal where I'd been documenting everything that happened, and the folder where I'd kept all the receipts from my costume purchases with his credit card. My father followed us through the house, ranting about conspiracy and manipulation, saying I'd poisoned everyone against him when all he'd done was enforce reasonable standards of dress and behavior for his teenage daughter. He kept insisting that the costumes proved I was disturbed and needed discipline, not coddling, and that my mother was enabling my destructive behavior by feeding into my delusions and lies. When my mother helped me remove the heavy brass diving helmet so I could see better to pack, my father grabbed it from her hands and threw it against my bedroom wall with such force that it left a dent in the drywall. Officer Rodriguez immediately entered the house and told my father in a firm voice that he needed to calm down immediately, or he would be arrested for assault and destruction of property, his hand now actually on his handcuffs. The threat of arrest seemed to penetrate my father's rage enough that he stepped back, but his face remained purple with fury as he watched me change out of the diving suit in my bathroom while my mother stood guard outside the door. When I emerged in normal clothes for the first time in a week, jeans and a t-shirt that felt strange after all the costumes, my mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that everything would be okay now, and she was so sorry she hadn't realized how bad things had gotten. We walked downstairs together where my father was now pacing in the living room while the officers watched him with professional vigilance, ready to intervene if he made any movement toward us. Sandra reminded him that violating the emergency custody order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges that would severely impact any future custody arrangements. Her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but a promise. My father tried one final time to prevent us from leaving, stepping toward the door, but Officer Rodriguez moved between us and told him that was close enough, that we would be leaving now and he would remain inside the house. As we got into my mother's car, I looked back to see my father standing in the doorway, his face twisted with rage as he kicked the doorframe so hard that I could hear the wood crack from across the driveway. That night at my mother's 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe, we sat at her small kitchen table while Sandra spread out various legal documents, explaining the next steps in what would undoubtedly be a complicated custody battle. She told us the hearing would be in 2 weeks and we needed to document absolutely everything that had happened, every incident, every threat, every controlling behavior going back as far as I could remember. The threat about the wilderness camp was particularly damaging to his case, Sandra explained, because those facilities had been investigated multiple times for abuse, and several teenagers had died in their care, making his threat to send me there a form of child endangerment. She'd already filed additional motions to prevent him from making any decisions about my education or medical care without court approval, and to freeze any ability to withdraw me from school or send me anywhere without both parents' consent. My mother made us chamomile tea while Sandra took photos of all my costume receipts with her phone, documenting the dates and amounts while creating a timeline of escalation that would be presented to the judge. My father's text messages started coming through around midnight, first apologetic and pleading, then increasingly angry and threatening as the reality of his situation became clear. He wrote that I'd destroyed his career and his relationship with Patricia, that I'd turned everyone against him with my lies and manipulation, and that I would regret this for the rest of my life. He said no college would accept me once they learned what kind of person I really was, how I'd destroyed my own father with false accusations and theatrical manipulation, and he would make sure everyone knew the truth about what I'd done. My mother took my phone and started screenshotting every message as they came in rapid succession, each one more unhinged than the last, creating a perfect record of harassment that violated the emergency custody order. Sandra called us back within minutes of receiving the forwarded messages, telling us this was exactly what she needed to show the judge that my father couldn't respect legal boundaries or control his behavior even when facing serious consequences. Monday morning at Roosevelt High School felt surreal as I walked through the familiar hallways, knowing I wouldn't be returning to my father's house that afternoon, or any afternoon in the foreseeable future. I went straight to Ms. Chen's counseling office, where she immediately stood up from her desk and pulled me into a professional but caring side hug, asking how I was doing after the weekend's events. She had a thick folder on her desk with my name on it, and I could see it contained printed emails from concerned teachers, her own handwritten notes from our conversations, and what appeared to be a timeline she'd been creating since the beekeeping suit incident. She explained that she'd been documenting everything as part of her mandatory reporting requirements, and had been in contact with CPS throughout the week as concerns escalated. We talked about safety planning at school, including what to do if my father showed up trying to take me out of classes or waiting in the parking lot after school. Right as Ms. Chen was explaining the school's protocols for protecting students in custody disputes, we heard shouting from the main office that was unmistakably my father's voice demanding to see his daughter. Through the counseling office window, I could see him at the front desk arguing with Mrs. Martinez, the head secretary, his face red as he insisted he had parental rights that superseded any piece of paper. Principal Davidson emerged from his office and positioned himself between my father and the hallway leading to the counseling offices, his voice calm but firm as he explained that my father needed to leave school property immediately. My father's voice grew louder with each exchange, accusing the school of kidnapping and conspiracy, saying they were violating his constitutional rights as a parent by keeping him from his daughter. The 2 school security officers, retired Phoenix police who worked part-time at the school, appeared and flanked Principal Davidson, their presence a clear signal that the situation was about to escalate if my father didn't comply. My father saw me watching through the counseling office window and pointed at me, shouting something about destroying our family that I couldn't fully hear through the glass but could see in the rage distorting his features. The security officers began moving toward him, explaining that he was now trespassing on school property and would be arrested if he didn't leave immediately, their hands on their radios ready to call for actual police backup. Ms. Chen immediately called my mother to inform her of the incident while simultaneously calling Sandra to document this violation of the custody order, speaking quickly but professionally into her phone while keeping her eyes on the scene unfolding in the main office. My father finally turned to leave, but not before slamming his hand on the counter so hard that a cup of pens scattered across the floor, the sound sharp enough to make everyone in the office flinch. As the security officers escorted him to the parking lot, I could see him gesturing wildly and continuing to shout, though his words were lost in the distance in the thick windows of the school building. That afternoon, my mother picked me up early from school because Joseph Tanaka from Child Protective Services was coming to conduct our first official interview about the situation. He arrived at Mom's apartment precisely at 3 o'clock, carrying a tablet and a thick case file that already had my name and case number on the label, suggesting this had become a priority investigation. Joseph had kind brown eyes but a serious expression as he sat across from me at the kitchen table, explaining that he'd been assigned to investigate the 17 different reports that had been filed by concerned citizens over the past week. He was thorough but gentle with his questions, starting with the original tank top incident and working through each day of costume escalation, asking for specific details about my father's words and reactions. I showed him photos on my phone of each costume while explaining the thought process behind each choice, how I'd deliberately escalated to make a point about the absurdity of his demands for modesty and coverage. Joseph took extensive notes on his tablet, occasionally asking me to repeat certain phrases my father had used, particularly the initial comment about dressing like someone advertising themselves and the threat about the wilderness camp. He took photos of all my costume receipts, documenting dates and amounts while creating his own timeline of events that would become part of the official CPS investigation. When I showed him the screenshot of the wilderness camp website my father had bookmarked on our shared family computer, showing Redemption Ranch's promises to break rebellious spirits through isolation and hard labor, his expression grew noticeably darker. He asked detailed questions about any previous controlling behavior, and I found myself telling him about years of my father choosing my clothes for important events, monitoring my social media, reading my text messages every night before bed, and throwing away clothes he deemed inappropriate without asking me. My mother sat beside me, occasionally adding her own observations from when they were married, describing patterns of control that she'd tried to address but had ultimately contributed to their divorce. Joseph's phone buzzed with a message that made him frown, and he informed us that my father had just been arrested at his office for creating a disturbance after being placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Apparently, he'd refused to leave the building when Human Resources tried to send him home, insisting this was all a misunderstanding that could be cleared up if people would just listen to his side of the story. The arrest for trespassing at his workplace would be added to the school trespassing incident and the violation of the emergency custody order, creating a pattern of escalating behavior that would significantly impact any custody decisions. My mother started crying quietly as Joseph explained that this level of deterioration in behavior was common when controlling parents suddenly lost the control they'd maintained for years, often leading to increasingly desperate and illegal attempts to regain power. 2 days later on Wednesday, I met with Alba Reeves, the court-appointed child advocate who would make recommendations to the judge about custody arrangements. Her office in the family courthouse was decorated with children's drawings and thank you cards from families she'd helped, creating a warm atmosphere despite the serious circumstances. Alba had already reviewed all the documentation from CPS, the school, and the police reports, and she wanted to hear directly from me about my relationship with my father before the clothing incident. I told her about growing up with constant criticism about my appearance, how my father would comment on my weight, my clothes, my posture, my facial expressions. Nothing was ever quite right in his eyes. She asked about positive memories with my father, and I struggled to think of times when his love didn't feel conditional on my complete compliance with his expectations and rules. Alba took detailed notes as I described the emotional exhaustion of constantly monitoring myself to avoid his criticism, never knowing what might trigger his anger or disappointment on any given day. She asked insightful questions about how I felt when wearing the costumes, and I explained that for the first time in my life, I was the one deciding what happened to my body, even if those decisions were deliberately absurd. The costumes had been my way of taking his control to such an extreme that everyone could see how wrong it was. making the invisible visible in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Alba nodded thoughtfully and said my creative protest showed remarkable insight and courage for someone my age, though she was concerned about the escalation to threats of wilderness camps and physical intimidation. She would be recommending supervised visitation only, with required therapy for my father before any unsupervised contact could be considered, and she wanted to ensure I had access to my own therapist to process everything that had happened. That evening, my mother received an unexpected call from Patricia, my father's ex-girlfriend who'd broken up with him via text on Sunday after hearing about the diving suit incident. Patricia wanted to meet with us to share her experiences during their 6-month relationship, saying she had information that might be relevant to the custody case. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Tempe where Patricia, an elegant woman in her 40s who worked as a marketing director, told us about the red flags she'd initially dismissed as quirks or protectiveness. She described how my father would comment constantly on her clothing choices, suggesting her skirts were too short for a woman her age or her blouses too revealing for professional settings, always framing his criticism as concern for her reputation. He'd started checking her phone to see who she was texting, getting upset when male colleagues liked her social media posts or sent friendly messages about work projects. She'd tried setting boundaries, but he'd accused her of being secretive and not understanding how men really thought about women who dressed and acted certain ways. The final straw for Patricia had been when he'd demanded she delete several male friends from her social media accounts, claiming it was inappropriate for a woman in a committed relationship to maintain friendships with other men, even colleagues she'd known for years. She'd realized then that his controlling behavior would only escalate, and when she heard about what he'd done to me over a simple tank top, she knew she'd made the right decision to leave when she did. Patricia offered to write a formal statement for the court about his patterns of controlling behavior toward women, and my mother gave her Sandra's contact information to coordinate the documentation. As we left the coffee shop, Patricia hugged me and apologized for not speaking up sooner, saying she'd suspected I was dealing with similar control but hadn't known how to address it without making things worse for me. Thursday morning brought the news through the grapevine of my father's workplace that he'd been placed on indefinite administrative leave after multiple employees came forward with complaints about inappropriate comments he'd made about female colleagues' clothing and appearance over the years. His coworker James, who'd always been friendly with our family, discreetly told my mother that the company was conducting a full investigation after the viral video of me in the medieval armor had been traced back to their organization. The regional manager was concerned about the company's reputation and liability, especially after learning about the CPS investigation and the arrest at the school. And there was talk of offering my father a severance package to leave quietly rather than face potential termination for cause. The human resources director had apparently been documenting complaints about my father for years, but hadn't had enough for action until this situation brought everything to light in an undeniable way. Friday was the day I had my first appointment with Dr. Lisa Washington, a therapist who specialized in helping teenagers deal with controlling parents and family trauma. Her office was in a converted house in Tempe with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that made it feel more like someone's living room than a medical facility. She started by asking me to describe my week of costume protests in my own words, without judgment or interpretation, just letting me tell the story from my perspective. As I talked, she occasionally asked clarifying questions, but mostly just listened with an expression of genuine interest and concern, taking notes in a small notebook she kept on her lap. When I got to the part about my father's threat to send me to Redemption Ranch, she stopped me and asked how I'd felt in that moment, what had gone through my mind when I realized he was serious. I told her about the fear that had shot through me like electricity, the realization that his need for control extended beyond clothes to wanting to literally send me away to be broken and rebuilt, according to his specifications. We talked about the difference between normal parental concern and pathological control, how my father's behavior had crossed line after line until I'd had to make myself impossible to ignore. Dr. Washington validated my creative resistance while also helping me process the genuine trauma of living under that level of scrutiny and control for 17 years of my life. She gave me exercises to practice setting boundaries and trusting my own judgment after years of being told my thoughts and feelings were wrong or inappropriate. We scheduled weekly sessions, and she said we'd work on rebuilding my sense of self, separate from my father's expectations and criticism, learning to trust my own voice again. The weekend passed quietly at my mother's apartment. a strange calm after the chaos of the previous week that felt both peaceful and unsettling. We ordered takeout and watched movies, trying to establish some sense of normalcy while both of us kept checking our phones for updates from Sandra about the legal proceedings. My mother apologized repeatedly for not protecting me better during the marriage and after, saying she'd been so focused on avoiding conflict with my father that she'd failed to see how his behavior was escalating. I told her I understood that she'd been trying to survive too, that his control hadn't started with me, but had been part of their marriage dynamic that ultimately led to their divorce. We spent Sunday going through old photo albums, and I pointed out patterns I now recognized in every picture. How my father always chose my outfits for important events. How my smile looked forced in photos where I was wearing clothes I'd hated. Monday brought an unexpected development when Mrs. Johnson from next door came over with a USB drive containing security camera footage from their house that showed my father yelling at me in our driveway on multiple occasions over the past year. She'd been saving the footage because she'd been concerned for a while, but hadn't known if it was her place to intervene in what seemed like family matters. The footage clearly showed him gesturing aggressively while I stood with my head down, and in one particularly disturbing clip from 3 months ago, he'd grabbed clothes from my hands and thrown them in the garbage can while screaming about appropriate dress. Mrs. Johnson said she and several other neighbors had written statements for the court about witnessing concerning behavior that predated the costume incident by years, patterns they'd observed but hadn't known how to address. She hugged me and said the whole neighborhood had been worried about me for a long time, but hadn't known how to help until my costume protest made it impossible to ignore what was happening. The custody hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock in the family court building downtown Phoenix, and I spent Wednesday evening with my mother and Sandra going over what would happen and what questions I might be asked. Sandra explained that Judge Catherine Reeves had a reputation for taking children's voices seriously and not tolerating parental alienation or control tactics, which worked in our favor given the extensive documentation we'd compiled. She showed us the thick folder of evidence, including photos of my costumes, receipts, text messages from my father, statements from neighbors and teachers, the CPS report, and Patricia's detailed account of his controlling behavior in their relationship. We practiced my testimony, with Sandra asking me potential questions while reminding me to stay calm and factual, to let the evidence speak for itself rather than getting emotional, though she said it was okay if I cried because this was emotional. My mother would testify, too, about the patterns she'd observed during their marriage and since, and several witnesses were prepared to appear if needed, including Ms. Chen and Mrs. Johnson. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, with monsoon clouds building over the mountains as we drove to the courthouse in downtown Phoenix. We met Sandra in the parking garage where she gave us final instructions about staying calm no matter what my father or his lawyer said, reminding us that judges had seen everything and weren't easily manipulated. Inside the courthouse, we passed through security and took the elevator to the 3rd floor where family court was held, the hallway filled with other families dealing with their own custody battles and disputes. My father arrived with his lawyer, an older man named Robert Collins who had a reputation for aggressive tactics in custody cases, and they walked past us without acknowledgement, though I could feel my father's eyes on me. We all stood when Judge Reeves entered. A woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a bun and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The hearing began with opening statements from both lawyers, Sandra laying out the pattern of controlling behavior culminating in the costume incident and the threat of wilderness camp, while Robert Collins argued this was a case of teenage rebellion being exploited by a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. Judge Reeves listened without expression, occasionally making notes on her legal pad, her face giving away nothing about her thoughts on the matter. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand on shaky legs, placing my hand on the Bible and promising to tell the truth while trying not to look at my father sitting at the respondent's table. Sandra asked me to describe the tank top incident in detail, and I explained how a normal outfit on a hot day had triggered my father calling me a derogatory term and forcing me to change into winter clothes. I told the judge about each costume choice, the reasoning behind the escalation, and how I'd wanted to make his control visible to others since my words alone had never been enough. Judge Reeves leaned forward when I described the moment my father threatened to send me to Redemption Ranch, asking me to explain exactly what he'd said and how he'd looked when saying it. I told her about the cold look in his eyes, the satisfaction in his voice as he described a place that would break my spirit, the way he'd already paid the deposit without even telling me it was a possibility. The judge's expression hardened as she made extensive notes, and I saw her underline something several times on her legal pad. When Robert Collins cross-examined me, he tried to make me admit I'd deliberately provoked my father and manipulated the situation, but I stayed calm and simply repeated the facts of what had happened. He suggested I was exaggerating or misremembering, but Sandra had prepared me for these tactics, and I stuck to the truth without elaboration or emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. My mother's testimony focused on the patterns she'd observed during their marriage, how my father's need for control had affected every aspect of their family life, from what they wore to who they could be friends with. She described how he'd thrown away her clothes he didn't like, monitored her phone and social media, and isolated her from friends and family who questioned his behavior. Patricia testified next, explaining how my father's controlling behavior had escalated during their 6-month relationship to the point where she'd feared for her safety if she didn't leave when she did. She told the judge about him demanding she delete male friends from social media, constantly criticizing her appearance and checking her phone without permission, patterns that exactly matched what he'd done to both my mother and me. Ms. Chen from school testified about the documentation she'd been keeping and her concerns about my emotional well-being under my father's control, describing the relief she'd seen in me since being removed from his household. When my father took the stand, his lawyer asked him softball questions about being a concerned parent trying to raise his daughter with proper values in a difficult world. My father sat up straighter, his sales persona emerging as he explained how he'd worked hard to provide for me, to give me every advantage, and just wanted me to present myself with dignity and self-respect. He claimed the tank top had been extremely revealing and inappropriate for a 17-year-old, though when Sandra showed the judge a photo of the actual outfit I'd worn that day, it was clearly a normal summer outfit that any teenager might wear. Judge Reeves asked my father directly about using derogatory terms to describe my clothing choices, and he fumbled his answer, claiming he didn't remember exactly what words he'd used, but that his intent had been protective, not harmful. When asked about the wilderness camp, he admitted he'd researched Redemption Ranch and paid a deposit, but claimed it was just to scare me into stopping the costume behavior, not a serious threat. Judge Reeves asked him if he knew that several teenagers had died at wilderness camps in Utah over the past decade, and that these facilities were under investigation for abuse and neglect. My father's face went pale as he stammered that he'd only heard positive things about teaching discipline and respect. But the judge shook her head and made more notes, looking increasingly displeased with his answers. Sandra introduced the evidence of his arrest at the school and workplace, the violated protective order, and the harassment via text message, painting a picture of someone who couldn't respect boundaries or accept consequences for his actions. The security footage from the Johnsons' house was played, showing my father's aggressive behavior toward me on multiple occasions, his body language threatening even without audio. When Robert Collins tried to argue this was taken out of context, Judge Reeves reminded him that throwing a teenager's clothes in the garbage while yelling at them was concerning in any context. After 3 hours of testimony and evidence, Judge Reeves said she'd heard enough to make her decision about temporary custody arrangements while the full investigation continued. She stated that based on the extensive evidence presented, including documented patterns of controlling behavior, threats to send me to a potentially abusive facility, and violations of court orders, she was granting my mother full temporary custody with supervised visitation only for my father. He would be allowed to see me for 2 hours every other Saturday at a court-approved family center with a social worker present to monitor all interactions and ensure my safety. He would need to complete anger management courses and participate in at least 6 months of therapy with a court-approved therapist who specialized in controlling behavior before any unsupervised visitation could even be considered. Additionally, he was prohibited from making any educational or medical decisions without my mother's consent and court approval. My father's lawyer immediately stood to object, calling the decision extreme and punitive, arguing that mistakes in parenting didn't warrant such severe restrictions on a father's right to see his daughter. Judge Reeves's voice turned cold as she reminded him that calling a teenage girl derogatory names for wearing weather-appropriate clothing, forcing her to cover herself in extreme ways, and threatening to send her to a facility known for abuse went far beyond parenting mistakes. She said the evidence showed a clear pattern of escalating control and intimidation that posed a genuine risk to my emotional and potentially physical well-being if left unchecked. The judge also issued a formal restraining order prohibiting my father from coming to my school, my mother's residence, or attempting to contact me outside of the supervised visitation sessions. Any violation would result in immediate termination of all parental rights and criminal charges. Outside the courthouse, my mother and I stood in the parking garage while Sandra explained the next steps in the process, including the full custody evaluation that would happen over the coming months. My father and his lawyer walked past us toward their cars, and I saw my father's face for just a moment, a mixture of rage and disbelief that his control had finally been broken. Sandra warned us that he might try to escalate despite the court orders, that men like him often became more dangerous when they lost control, and we needed to be vigilant about our safety. She gave us both cards for a domestic violence support group and reminded us to document any attempts at contact or violations of the restraining order, no matter how minor they might seem. As we drove home, the monsoon finally broke over Phoenix, rain pounding on the windshield while my mother reached over and squeezed my hand, both of us crying with relief that the first battle was over. The following Saturday was my first supervised visitation with my father at the Maricopa County Family Visitation Center, a building that looked like a converted daycare with colorful murals trying to mask its serious purpose. My stomach churned as my mother drove me there, even though I knew there would be a social worker present and my father couldn't hurt me or force me to leave with him. The waiting room had other kids ranging from toddlers to teenagers, all there for supervised visits with parents the court had deemed unsafe for unsupervised contact. My father arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a new suit and carrying flowers that the social worker, a kind woman named Diana, immediately confiscated, explaining that gifts weren't allowed during supervised visitation as they could be used for manipulation. We were led to a small room with toys and books designed for younger children, a round table with 4 chairs, and a one-way mirror that I knew had cameras behind it recording everything. My father spent the first hour trying to convince me that therapy was helping him understand his mistakes, that he'd changed completely in just 2 weeks, which seemed impossible to anyone who understood how deep his control issues ran. He kept asking when I could come home, when things could go back to normal, while Diana gently redirected him to focus on the present moment rather than future expectations that weren't his to set. I gave short answers to his questions about school and friends, not trusting him with any real information about my life that he might somehow use against me later. The second hour dragged even longer, with my father trying different tactics to engage me. From talking about movies we used to watch together to promising he'd never comment on my clothes again if I'd just give him another chance. When the 2 hours finally ended, he tried to hug me goodbye, but I stepped back, and Diana noted this on her clipboard before walking us to separate exits. Over the next month, a pattern emerged with the supervised visits where my father would cycle through different manipulation tactics, trying to regain some control over our relationship. Some weeks he'd be apologetic and sad, talking about how much he missed me and how empty the house was without me there, trying to guilt me into feeling sorry for him. Other weeks he'd be angry and accusatory, saying I'd ruined his life over nothing, that I'd blown a simple disagreement about clothes into something that destroyed his career and reputation. Diana documented everything in her reports, noting his inability to take genuine responsibility for his actions and his continued attempts to minimize what he'd done as normal parenting. She told my mother after the 4th visit that my father showed classic signs of narcissistic control patterns, and that his participation in therapy seemed performative rather than genuine. School became my refuge during this time, a place where I could focus on something other than custody battles and supervised visits. My grades actually improved without the constant anxiety of going home to my father's criticism and control, and I found myself participating more in class discussions now that I trusted my own voice. The debate team coach noticed my improvement and made me second chair for our upcoming tournament, saying my personal statement about finding your voice when someone tries to silence you was one of the strongest arguments she'd seen from a student. My friends, who'd known something was wrong but hadn't known how to help, rallied around me with the support I hadn't expected, from study sessions at their houses to just sitting with me at lunch when I didn't feel like talking. Even kids I barely knew approached me to say they'd seen the videos of my costume protest and thought it was brilliant, that I'd found a creative way to expose abuse that adults couldn't ignore. 3 months into the new arrangement, my father's therapist requested a joint session with me to work on our relationship with professional support and guidance. My mother left the decision entirely up to me, and after discussing it with Dr. Washington for several sessions, I agreed to try one meeting to see if my father had made any genuine progress. The session was held at the therapist's office, a neutral location that felt safer than the family center, with both therapists present to facilitate the conversation. My father actually started by giving what seemed like a genuine apology, acknowledging that he'd let his fears about protecting me turn into controlling behavior that had harmed me emotionally and damaged our relationship possibly beyond repair. He admitted that calling me derogatory names was abusive, that threatening the wilderness camp was wrong, and that he'd prioritized his image and control over my well-being and autonomy. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe he was actually changing. But then he added that he hoped I could understand he'd only acted that way because he loved me so much and wanted to protect me from a dangerous world. Dr. Washington immediately intervened, pointing out that framing abuse as love was another form of manipulation and showed he still wasn't taking full responsibility for his choices. The session ended with me feeling confused and drained, unsure whether his apology was real or just another performance designed to regain access to me. My therapist spent our next session helping me process the complex emotions of wanting to believe my father could change while protecting myself from further harm if he couldn't or wouldn't do the real work required. She reminded me that his journey toward accountability wasn't my responsibility, and that I could choose to limit or end contact if that's what I needed for my own healing. 6 months after the initial custody hearing, Judge Reeves scheduled a review to assess whether any modifications to the custody arrangement were warranted based on my father's progress in therapy and anger management. The courtroom felt familiar now, less intimidating than that first appearance, though my stomach still knotted as my father entered with Robert Collins, both looking confident about their chances of getting unsupervised visitation. Sandra had prepared a thick folder of documentation from the supervised visits, showing my father's continued attempts at manipulation and his failure to demonstrate genuine understanding of his abusive behavior. Diana testified about her observations, particularly noting that my father seemed more focused on regaining control than on repairing the relationship through genuine accountability and change. She described how he'd violated the spirit, if not the letter of the visitation rules multiple times, trying to extract information about my mother's life and making subtle threats about legal action if I didn't cooperate with his wishes. My father's therapist testified that while he'd attended all required sessions, his participation was what she called superficially compliant, going through the motions without genuine engagement in the therapeutic process. She expressed concerns about his continued minimization of his behavior and his tendency to blame others, particularly me and my mother, for the consequences of his own actions. When she'd tried to explore his childhood and family patterns that might have contributed to his controlling behavior, he'd become defensive and refused to engage, saying the past had nothing to do with the current situation. Judge Reeves asked the therapist directly whether she believed unsupervised visitation was safe and appropriate at this time, and the therapist said she couldn't recommend it without significant additional progress in therapy. My father's face turned red as his own therapist essentially testified against him, his hands clenching on the table as he whispered urgently to his lawyer. When my father took the stand, he tried to present himself as a changed man who'd learned from his mistakes and just wanted to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. He talked about the books he'd read about controlling behavior, the worksheets he'd completed in anger management, the apologies he'd offered during supervised visits that I'd rejected. Robert Collins presented certificates of completion from various programs as evidence of his client's commitment to change, but Judge Reeves seemed unimpressed by paper achievements without corresponding behavioral changes. When Sandra cross-examined him, she asked specific questions about what he'd learned, what he would do differently, and he gave vague answers about respecting boundaries and listening better without demonstrating real understanding of the harm he'd caused. She asked him to explain why calling his teenage daughter a derogatory term for wearing normal summer clothes was wrong, and he said because it upset me, still not understanding that the problem was his mindset, not just my reaction. Judge Reeves delivered her decision with the same firm tone she'd used 6 months earlier, stating that while she acknowledged my father's attendance at required programs, she saw no evidence of genuine change or understanding that would warrant loosening the restrictions. She ordered supervised visitation to continue for at least another 6 months, with a requirement that my father engage in more intensive therapy, specifically focused on abuse and control rather than general anger management. She also ordered him to attend a perpetrators program for controlling partners, noting that his patterns extended beyond parenting into intimate relationships based on Patricia's testimony. My father's lawyer immediately filed an appeal, arguing the requirements were excessive and punitive. But Judge Reeves reminded him that protecting children from emotional abuse was the court's primary concern, not accommodating an abusive parent's desires. The judge also made it clear that any violation of the current orders would result in termination of all parental rights, a warning that made my father's face go pale. As my 18th birthday approached, I realized I would soon have the legal right to choose whether to continue any relationship with my father without court involvement or requirements. The thought was both liberating and terrifying, knowing the decision would be entirely mine without judges or social workers or therapists making recommendations. My mother and I had long conversations about what I wanted, and she made it clear she'd support whatever decision I made, whether that was continuing supervised visits, trying to build something new, or cutting contact entirely. Dr. Washington helped me explore my feelings without pushing me in any direction, acknowledging that there was no right answer, only what felt right for me and my healing process. I wrote lists of pros and cons, letters to my father I never sent, and journal entries trying to imagine different futures with or without him in my life. My birthday fell on a Saturday, which would normally be a visitation day, but I chose to skip it and instead celebrated with my mother and friends at a restaurant where I could wear whatever I wanted without anyone commenting on my choices. My father sent a card to my mother's apartment with a check inside and a brief message saying he hoped someday I'd understand he'd only wanted what was best for me, still unable to fully acknowledge the harm he'd caused. I deposited the check because college was expensive and I figured it was the least he could do, but I didn't respond to the card or feel obligated to thank him for money that should have been freely given anyway. That night, surrounded by people who loved me without conditions or criticism, I realized how different my life had become without the constant weight of his judgment and control. I wore a dress I'd chosen myself, not to make a point or protest anything, but simply because I liked how it looked and felt. And that freedom was worth everything I'd gone through to achieve it. College applications consumed my senior year, with essays about overcoming adversity and finding your voice that practically wrote themselves given everything I'd experienced with my father. My counselor said my personal statement about the costume protest was one of the most compelling she'd read in her 20 years at Roosevelt High, showing creativity, courage, and resilience in the face of abuse. I applied to 7 universities, but my heart was set on attending the state university's pre-law program, wanting to become an advocate for other teenagers trapped in controlling households who needed someone to fight for them. The acceptance letter arrived in March with a partial scholarship based on both merit and my essay about standing up to oppression through creative resistance. My mother cried when I showed her the acceptance letter, proud that I'd turned trauma into triumph, using my experience to fuel my future rather than let it define my limits. Graduation day arrived hot and humid, a typical May day in Phoenix where the morning sun already promised afternoon temperatures over 100 degrees. I sat with my classmates in the football stadium, wearing my cap and gown over a sundress I'd chosen myself, no longer thinking about whether someone would approve or criticize my choices. My mother sat in the third row of the parent section with Tom, her new boyfriend she'd started dating 6 months earlier, a gentle man who worked as a nurse and treated both of us with respect and kindness. My father sat several rows behind them, having been granted permission to attend if he maintained distance and didn't attempt contact outside the ceremony, a compromise we'd reached through lawyers. When they called my name to receive my diploma, I heard both parents cheering, and for a moment it felt like maybe we could find some kind of peace, even if we'd never be a traditional family again. After the ceremony, we took separate photos as agreed, with my father getting 15 minutes in the designated area while my mother waited by the car with Tom. My father gave me a graduation card with another check and said he was proud of my acceptance to university, managing not to make any comments about my appearance or choices for once. He asked if I might consider having lunch occasionally over the summer before I left for college. No pressure, just a chance to talk without social workers taking notes. I told him I'd think about it, which was more than I'd been willing to offer 6 months earlier, but less than he clearly hoped for. His face showing disappointment masked quickly by forced understanding. As he walked away toward his car, I noticed how much older he looked. His hair grayer and face more lined than I remembered from before everything happened. The cost of losing control visible in every step. Summer passed in a blur of preparation for college, shopping for dorm supplies with my mother, and working extra shifts at the bookstore to save money for expenses not covered by my scholarship. I did meet my father for lunch 3 times at a public restaurant, finding that without the power dynamic of parent and minor child, he seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating and more like a flawed human who'd made terrible choices. We talked about safe topics like movies and books, avoiding anything about the past or future, existing in a careful present tense that didn't require forgiveness or forgetting. He never commented on my clothes or appearance, though I sometimes caught him starting to say something before stopping himself. The old patterns still there, but finally under some control. Each lunch ended with awkward goodbyes and his hope that we could do it again, which I neither confirmed nor denied, keeping my power to choose when and if I saw him. The day I left for college, my father sent a text saying he hoped I knew he loved me even if he'd shown it wrong, which was the closest he'd ever come to a real acknowledgement of harm. I didn't respond immediately, sitting with the complex emotions of loving someone who'd hurt you, wanting them to be better while protecting yourself from disappointment if they couldn't change. Dr. Washington had prepared me for this feeling, the grief of losing the father I'd wished for while accepting the one I actually had, flawed and limited in his capacity for growth. I finally texted back a simple thank you, not for the sentiment, but for finally trying to respect my boundaries, however imperfectly he managed it. My mother drove me to campus with the car loaded with everything I'd need for my new life, both of us crying a little as we pulled away from the apartment that had become my safe haven. My dorm room was small but mine to decorate however I wanted, and I hung up photos of friends and family, including one old picture of my father and me at the zoo when I was 7, before the control had gotten so bad. My roommate asked about my family, and I gave her the simplified version, that my parents were divorced and I lived with my mom, saving the full story for if we became closer friends who'd earned that vulnerability. Classes started, and I threw myself into pre-law courses, finding purpose in learning about justice systems and advocacy, understanding how the law had protected me when my father wouldn't respect boundaries. My professor in family law was particularly impressed with my insights into custody disputes and controlling relationships, though I didn't share the personal experience that informed my understanding. I joined the student advocacy group on campus, helping other students navigate difficult family situations and connecting them with resources, turning my trauma into something useful for others. First semester grades came back strong, proving I could succeed without my father's criticism driving me or his control limiting my choices, my own motivation more powerful than his pressure had ever been. I went home for winter break to find my mother had fully redecorated the apartment, removing any traces of the life we'd lived under my father's shadow, creating something new and entirely ours. She'd been promoted at the hospital to head nurse of her department, flourishing professionally without the stress of managing my father's moods and demands at home. Tom had become a regular presence, though he was careful not to overstep, understanding that trust had to be earned after everything we'd been through with controlling men. We spent the holidays peacefully, a stark contrast to the tension-filled Christmases at my father's house, where every gift and meal had been an opportunity for criticism. My father sent a Christmas card with yet another check and a note saying he'd started dating someone new and was trying to apply what he'd learned in therapy to not repeat old patterns. I felt a mix of skepticism and hope for this unknown woman, wondering if he'd really changed or if she'd eventually face the same control I'd escaped from. I didn't reach out to wish him happy holidays, but I didn't tear up the card either. Progress in its own small way toward some kind of neutral coexistence. The spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities, including an internship at a family law firm where I could observe real custody cases and see how other families navigated these painful situations. My supervisor was impressed with my maturity and insight, not knowing they came from lived experience rather than textbook learning, and offered me a summer position that would give me valuable experience for law school applications. As freshman year ended, I reflected on how different my life had become in the 2 years since the tank top incident that had changed everything. The costumes that had started as desperate protest were now just a funny story I might tell close friends, the visible manifestation of invisible abuse that had finally made people pay attention. My relationship with my father remained minimal and carefully boundaried. Lunch every few months when I was home, birthday and holiday cards with checks but no real connection or trust. He'd never fully apologized or taken complete responsibility, but he'd learned to keep his criticism and control to himself, which was perhaps the best outcome I could hope for. My mother and I had grown closer through the experience, our relationship stronger for having survived and escaped together, supporting each other through the healing process. The diving suit and beekeeper outfit were long gone, donated to the community theater, but the lessons they'd taught me about creative resistance and making invisible harm visible stayed with me always. Sometimes in class discussions about power dynamics and abuse, I'd share pieces of my story, watching other students realize that abuse doesn't always look like what they expected, that control can be subtle until you make it obvious. My professor asked me to write about my experience for the law review, saying it could help other young people recognize controlling behavior and find creative ways to seek help when direct communication failed. I agreed, writing under a pseudonym to maintain some privacy while sharing the knowledge that costume protests had given me voice when words alone weren't enough. The article was published to positive response, with emails from other students sharing their own stories of creative resistance against family control and abuse. Second year of college brought new challenges as courses got harder, and the internship demanded more time. But I thrived under pressure I'd chosen rather than pressure imposed by someone else's expectations. My father reached out occasionally, respecting when I said I was too busy to meet, a boundary he never would have accepted before the court orders forced him to recognize limits. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been transferred to a different division at work, where he had no direct reports, a demotion disguised as a lateral move after the investigation into his behavior. His new girlfriend lasted 8 months before leaving, and I wondered if she'd seen the red flags Patricia had warned about, or if he'd hidden them better initially. Part of me felt sad for his inability to maintain healthy relationships, but mostly I felt grateful to be free from the cycle of control and criticism that had defined my childhood. Junior year arrived with law school applications and LSAT preparation consuming most of my time and energy outside of regular coursework and the continuing internship at the family law firm. My personal statement wrote itself, weaving together themes of justice, advocacy, and the importance of creative resistance when traditional channels fail to protect vulnerable people from abuse. The senior partner at my internship firm offered to write me a recommendation letter, saying I had natural instincts for family law that couldn't be taught, not knowing those instincts came from surviving my own custody battle. My mother celebrated each small victory with me, from good LSAT scores to acceptance letters, her pride genuine and unconditional in a way my father's never had been. She and Tom got engaged that spring, and I was genuinely happy for her, seeing how he treated her with respect and partnership rather than control and criticism. My father wasn't invited to the wedding, a decision my mother left entirely to me since it was my boundary to set or adjust as I felt comfortable. I chose to maintain the separation, knowing his presence would make me anxious and ruin what should be a joyful day for my mother after everything she'd overcome. He sent a card with no money this time, just a note saying he understood and hoped I was happy, the closest he'd come to respecting a boundary without complaint or manipulation. The wedding was beautiful and small, just family and close friends in the backyard of Tom's house. Everyone relaxed and genuine without the performance my father had always demanded at public events. I gave a speech about my mother's strength and resilience, how she'd saved both of us when she recognized the danger and took action. My voice steady and strong as I spoke my truth. Law school acceptance letters arrived in early spring, including a full scholarship to my top choice program known for its family law clinic and advocacy work. My mother cried when I told her, remembering the scared 17-year-old in a diving suit who'd found creative ways to cry for help when words weren't enough. My father sent a congratulations card with a check larger than usual, and a note saying he knew I'd make a difference for families in crisis. Perhaps understanding finally that his behavior had shaped my passion for protecting others. I deposited the check without guilt, considering it partial reparations for years of therapy and the emotional work required to heal from his abuse. Graduation from undergrad came with highest honors and a special award for my advocacy work with students facing family crisis. My costume protest now transformed into professional purpose. The summer before law school, I worked full-time at the family law firm, handling real cases under supervision and seeing the patterns of control and abuse that appeared across different families. Each case reinforced my commitment to becoming an advocate for young people trapped in controlling households, giving them the voice and validation I'd needed so desperately. My supervisor offered me a position to return each summer during law school with the possibility of permanent placement after graduation if I maintained my academic performance. I accepted immediately, knowing this was exactly where I wanted to build my career, helping families navigate the complex intersection of love and harm that characterized abusive relationships. My father reached out about meeting before I left for law school, but I declined, feeling no obligation to provide closure or comfort for someone who'd never fully acknowledged the harm they'd caused. Law school proved challenging but purposeful. Every case study and legal theory connecting to my lived experience of how the system could protect or fail vulnerable family members. I excelled in family law and child advocacy courses, my professors noting my unusual insight into the dynamics of controlling relationships and the creative ways victims seek help. My second year, I was selected to lead the student clinic providing legal services to families in crisis, where I could directly apply my knowledge to help others escape abuse. One case involved a teenage girl whose father controlled her clothing and social life, and I helped her document the pattern of abuse that others might dismiss as strict parenting. Together, we built a case that resulted in her safe placement with her grandmother, and she hugged me afterward, saying I was the first person to really understand what she was experiencing. That case and others like it confirmed that my costume protest hadn't just saved me, but had given me the tools and passion to save others from similar control and abuse. My thesis focused on creative resistance in abuse situations, documenting various ways victims make invisible harm visible when traditional reporting methods fail or aren't believed. The faculty selected it for publication in the Law Review, with potential expansion into a book that could help both victims and advocates recognize and respond to controlling behavior. My mother attended the thesis defense, proud beyond words that her daughter had transformed trauma into expertise that would help countless others escape similar situations. Even my father sent a note saying he'd heard about my success from mutual acquaintances, though I noticed he still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge his role in creating both the trauma and the passion that drove my advocacy. As law school graduation approached, I received multiple job offers but accepted the position at the family law firm where I'd interned, knowing they'd support my focus on advocacy for young people in controlling families. My supervisor, now my colleague, said she'd rarely seen someone so young understand so deeply the complexities of family abuse and the creative ways victims seek freedom. I didn't tell her that understanding came from living it, from spending a week in increasingly ridiculous costumes to make visible the control that had constrained me for 17 years. My mother and Tom came to my law school graduation, sitting proudly in the audience as I received my doctorate with honors and special recognition for my advocacy work. My father had asked to attend, but I declined, maintaining the boundary that protected my peace and allowed me to celebrate without anxiety about his presence or potential behavior. The bar exam results arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I'd passed on my first attempt, officially becoming an attorney qualified to represent families in crisis and children seeking freedom from abuse. My first case as a licensed attorney involved a 16-year-old whose mother controlled every aspect of her appearance and social life, calling her degrading names when she tried to express individuality. I helped her document the pattern, build evidence, and ultimately gain placement with her father, who supported her autonomy and self-expression. When we won the case, the girl thanked me for believing her when others had dismissed her mother's behavior as protective parenting gone slightly overboard. I told her that sometimes making abuse visible requires creativity and courage, that her voice mattered even when adults tried to silence it, wisdom earned from my own journey through costume protests to freedom. 5 years into my career, I published the book expanding my thesis on creative resistance in family abuse situations, dedicating it to all the young people making themselves impossible to ignore. The book tour included speaking engagements at law schools and conferences where I shared my story, including photos of the costumes that had saved my life by making control undeniable. My father attended one speaking engagement in Phoenix, sitting in the back row where I could see him, but he couldn't disrupt. His presence neither welcome nor forbidden, just neutrally acknowledged. After the talk, he approached briefly to say he'd read the book and finally understood what I'd been trying to show him, though he still stopped short of full acknowledgement or genuine apology. I thanked him for coming and moved on to speak with other attendees, no longer needing his validation or approval to know my truth and worth. My mother remained my strongest supporter, attending every major event and celebrating each victory in my career, as I helped more families escape cycles of control and abuse. She and Tom had built a peaceful life together, modeling what healthy partnership looked like after years of controlling dysfunction with my father had taught us both what to avoid. Sometimes she apologized for not protecting me sooner, but I reminded her that we'd both been surviving and had ultimately saved each other when it mattered most. The diving suit incident had been the catalyst that changed everything, transforming a pattern of escalating control into visible abuse that couldn't be ignored or dismissed any longer. That week of costumes had been my rebellion and my salvation, creative resistance that gave me voice when words alone had failed to convey the weight of living under constant criticism and control. Now, at 30 years old, I run a legal clinic specifically for young people in controlling families, providing free representation and advocacy for those who can't afford traditional legal services. Every case reinforces the importance of creative resistance, of finding ways to make invisible harm visible when traditional channels fail to protect vulnerable family members. My father and I maintain minimal contact, birthday cards and occasional emails about neutral topics, a relationship reduced to its smallest sustainable form that protects my peace while acknowledging his existence. He never fully apologized or took complete responsibility for the harm he caused, but he learned through legal force to respect boundaries he'd once trampled without thought or care. The costumes that saved me hang in a special display at the clinic, a reminder to young clients that sometimes the most powerful resistance comes from unexpected creativity and the courage to be impossible to ignore. The tank top that started everything was just a normal piece of clothing on a hot day. But my father's reaction to it revealed the deep sickness of his need to control my body and choices. His calling me that horrible name for wearing weather-appropriate clothes had been the final straw that broke my silence and sparked my creative rebellion through costume escalation. Each outfit had been carefully chosen to highlight the absurdity of his demands for coverage and modesty, making visible to others what I'd suffered privately for years. The beekeeping suit, the burka, the hazmat gear, the Victorian mourning dress, the medieval armor, and finally the diving suit had been my voice when he wouldn't listen to words. They'd saved me by making it impossible for teachers, neighbors, coworkers, and ultimately the legal system to ignore what was happening in our household behind closed doors. Looking back now from a place of safety and professional success, I see those costumes as my teenage self's brilliant strategy for survival and resistance against overwhelming control. They'd transformed me from victim to creative activist, using malicious compliance to expose the malicious control that had constrained my entire childhood and adolescence. The week of escalating costumes had cost my father his reputation, his relationship, his promotion, and ultimately his unlimited access to continue abusing me through criticism and control. But more importantly, they'd given me my freedom, my voice, and eventually my career advocating for other young people trapped in similar situations of family control and abuse. The diving suit that had seemed so absurd in the Arizona heat had actually been the perfect metaphor for how his control had been suffocating me, requiring extreme measures to break free. My story has helped hundreds of families recognize and escape controlling behavior that might otherwise be dismissed as strict but loving parenting or protective concern gone too far. Every young person who reads my book or hears my speeches and recognizes their own experience in my costume protest is another validation that the resistance was worth the chaos it caused. The legal precedent set by my case has been cited in numerous custody decisions, where controlling behavior escalated to emotional abuse requiring court intervention and protection. My father's threat about the wilderness camp, captured in my recording, has been used as evidence in cases preventing other parents from sending their children to abusive treatment facilities. The documentation my neighbors and teachers created has become a template for concerned community members who suspect abuse but aren't sure how to help effectively. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just complied with his demands for modest dress without the elaborate protest that changed everything so dramatically. Would the control have escalated anyway to something even worse? Or would I have survived until 18 and escaped to college carrying invisible wounds that never healed properly? The costume protest had forced a crisis that revealed the true extent of his controlling nature, not just to others but to me, helping me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't normal parenting, but abuse. Without that week of escalating outfits making the invisible visible, I might have internalized his criticism and spent years in therapy trying to understand why I felt so worthless and controlled. Instead, the costumes had externalized the problem, making it clear that his behavior was the issue. not my normal teenage desire for autonomy and self-expression. The ripple effects of that single week continue spreading as my work helps other families recognize and address controlling behavior before it escalates to the level I experienced. Every parent who reads my story and recognizes their own controlling tendencies has the opportunity to change before losing their child as my father lost me. Every teenager who sees themselves in my costume protest learns that creative resistance is possible and that their voice matters even when adults try to silence it. Every judge who reads my case files understands better how emotional abuse through control can be just as damaging as physical violence, requiring the same legal protections and interventions. The costumes that seemed like desperate teenage rebellion were actually sophisticated protest art, making abstract harm concrete and visible in ways that demanded response and protection. My clinic now has a wall of photos from young clients who found their own creative ways to resist family control and seek help when direct communication failed. Some wore their own costume protests, others documented abuse through art or writing, and many simply found courage in knowing that someone else had survived and thrived after similar experiences. Each story reinforces that resistance takes many forms, but always requires the courage to make invisible harm visible enough that others can't ignore or dismiss it anymore. The diving suit remains the most powerful symbol, representing both the suffocating weight of control and the extreme measures sometimes necessary to break free from those who claim to love you, while systematically destroying your autonomy and self-worth. Today, as I prepare to argue another custody case for a teenager whose father controls her appearance and social life, I wear professional clothes I chose myself without anxiety or second-guessing. The simple freedom to dress appropriately for weather and occasion without fear of criticism or punishment is something I'll never take for granted after 17 years of controlled clothing choices. My father's voice no longer echoes in my head when I shop for clothes or get dressed in the morning. His criticism finally silenced by years of therapy and the boundary of minimal contact. The woman I've become would be unrecognizable to the scared girl in the tank top who just wanted to go to the grocery store without being called horrible names for showing her arms. That girl's creative courage in the face of escalating control saved not just herself, but countless others who found freedom through the precedent her costume protest established. The cycle of control that might have continued through generations has been broken, disrupted by a teenager in a diving suit who refused to remain invisible and silent any longer. My future children will never know the weight of constant criticism or the exhaustion of monitoring every choice for potential disapproval from a controlling parent. They'll grow up with autonomy and respect for their choices, wearing what feels right for them without fear of being called names or forced to cover their bodies in shame. The legacy of that week of costumes is freedom not just for me, but for all the families I help escape similar cycles of control and abuse through legal advocacy and public education. What started as desperate protest has become professional purpose, transforming trauma into expertise that serves others facing the same impossible situation I once survived. The tank top hangs in my closet now, just another piece of clothing without the weight of that painful memory, worn on hot days without thought or anxiety about anyone's opinion. My father's red-faced anger over that simple summer outfit has faded to a distant echo, overwhelmed by years of my own voice growing stronger through education, advocacy, and the freedom to make my own choices. The costumes served their purpose and have been retired, donated to help others tell their stories, or simply disposed of as artifacts of a battle that's been won decisively through legal protection and personal growth. But their spirit lives on in every creative act of resistance against family control. Every young person who finds their voice through unexpected means when traditional channels fail them. The girl in the diving suit has become a woman in a courtroom, still fighting the same battle but now with law degrees and legal precedent instead of costumes and teenage determination. As this story reaches its end after 60 minutes of continuous narrative, the message remains clear and powerful for anyone listening who might recognize their own experience in my journey from control to freedom. Your voice matters even when people try to silence it. Your autonomy is worth fighting for even when the battle seems impossible, and creative resistance can succeed where direct confrontation fails. The costumes were never really about the clothes, but about making visible the invisible harm of emotional abuse through control, forcing acknowledgement and action from a community that might otherwise dismiss teenage complaints as typical rebellion. Every person listening who feels trapped by family control should know that freedom is possible, that creative resistance is valid, and that your truth deserves to be heard even if you have to dress in a diving suit to make people listen. The transformation from victim to advocate took years of therapy, education, and determination, but it started with a single moment of deciding that enough was enough and that compliance was no longer an option. That moment when my father called me that horrible name for wearing a tank top on a 90-degree day was the spark that ignited a creative rebellion that would ultimately save my life and career. Each costume had been a step toward freedom, each outfit an escalation that made his control more visible and harder for others to ignore or excuse as concerned parenting. The diving suit that ended that week of protest had been both the most absurd and the most perfect representation of how his control had been suffocating me beneath layers of criticism and shame. Breaking free had required making myself impossible to ignore, transforming from invisible victim to visible protester whose creative resistance demanded response and protection from abuse. Now, as successful attorney advocating for young people in controlling families, I carry the lessons of that week with me into every case and every courtroom where children's voices need amplification against adult control. The costumes may be gone, but their impact continues rippling outward through legal precedent, published writings, public speeches, and direct advocacy that helps families recognize and escape cycles of control and abuse. My father remains a diminished presence in my life, reduced to occasional cards and emails that maintain minimal contact without granting access to continue any form of control or criticism. He lost his daughter the day he called her that horrible name, though it took a week of costumes and months of legal battles to make that loss official and permanent through custody changes. The price of his control was everything he'd claimed to be protecting: his reputation, career advancement, relationships, and ultimately his daughter's presence in his life beyond the absolute minimum. This story serves as both cautionary tale and inspiration, warning parents about the cost of control while encouraging young people to find their voice through whatever creative means necessary when traditional channels fail. The journey from that tank top to this moment of professional success and personal freedom has been long and difficult, but ultimately triumphant through the power of creative resistance and community support. Every teenager who hears this story and recognizes their own controlling parent should know that your feelings are valid. The control is abuse, not love, and freedom is possible even when it seems impossibly distant. The courage to resist can take many forms, from costumes to art to writing to simply telling someone who will listen and believe your truth about what happens behind closed doors. The most important thing is making the invisible visible, transforming private suffering into public knowledge that demands response and protection from those with power to intervene. As this extended narrative concludes, the message resonates clear and strong that no one should have to live under the suffocating control that masquerades as parental concern or protection. The costumes that seemed like teenage rebellion were actually sophisticated protest art that exposed the truth about emotional abuse through control of appearance and autonomy. My father's inability to see past his own need for control cost him any meaningful relationship with his daughter, reducing him to a cautionary example in legal textbooks and advocacy presentations. The girl he tried to shame for wearing weather-appropriate clothing has become a woman who helps other families escape similar shame and control through legal advocacy and public education. The diving suit that once symbolized the suffocating weight of his criticism now represents the creative courage necessary to break free from those who claim to love you while systematically destroying your self-worth. Thank you for listening to this 60-minute journey through costume protest to professional purpose, from controlled childhood to autonomous adulthood, through creative resistance and legal protection. May every person trapped in controlling family dynamics find their own path to freedom, whether through costumes or other creative means that make invisible harm impossible to ignore. The tank top that started everything was just clothing, but the freedom to choose what covers our bodies is fundamental to human autonomy and dignity that no parent should violate through shame and control. My story is one of many, but each story of successful resistance against family control adds to the collective power of survivors who refuse to remain silent and invisible any longer. The costumes have been retired, but their legacy lives on in every young person who finds their voice and claims their freedom from those who would control them in the name of love.